As part of our mission, we organize around 30 events a year together with our 17 amazing partners from the world of science. And that's exactly what we are doing today with this event and our partner, the German Embassy, Washington, and the German Consulate General, San Francisco. Well, welcome again to this WebEx hosted by Deutsche Telekom. Allow me some brief remarks. This platform is GDPR compliant. We will record this event and it will be available on the DWH New York YouTube channel afterwards. Also, you're invited to ask questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you might either use the Q&A function or send us a comment on the upcoming discussion in the chat below. We will collect your submitted question and send them to the panel. Now, I have the honor to announce the opening remarks of the German ambassador to the United States, Emily Harbour. Science diplomacy becomes more and more important in a world where we cannot take for granted that scientists and researchers and their work is acknowledged. So thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, Ambassador, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Fenner, for your introduction, and good morning, everybody. I apologize for this delay. I'm very pleased, however, that you could join us today for the first virtual exchange on distance learning across the Atlantic and beyond. Your keen interest has shown how important it is to share and discuss the experiences gained over the past months in the area of education. Thank you very much for your active participation and contributions to this enormously important topic. All of a sudden, in March, the coronavirus crisis confronted our education system with a huge challenge. Classroom instruction had to switch to digital formats, quite literally from one day to the next. And I am amazed how successfully this was achieved, and that teaching could continue, not least by dint of dedication and creativity of all concerned. Of course, primary and secondary schools first come to mind, but universities and kindergartens and pre-K and institutions of higher learning and many other educational institutions were and are also affected by this situation. By now, US and German educational institutions have been in this predicament for nearly 7 months. Even though in many places, school children and students have been able to return, at least partially, to in-person instruction after the summer vacation, we're still far from normalcy. Moreover, when we look at the surge of new cases, it may be only a question of time before we experience new setbacks. Yet, how have digital media and distance learning changed the quality of teaching and learning? Parents will ask, will digital devices induce digital dementia in our children if used too much? How much screen time is enough? And which platforms can we use to strengthen the best practice exchange between teachers and educational institutions? These are only a few of the most pressing questions for today's discussion. I'm very glad that this event can contribute to the agenda of the German presidency of the European Council, where the topic of digital society features prominently. For me, one thing is clear. There's no exclusive medium on which good education will hinge. Good education, be it books or notebooks or the chalkboard, it's always the educational design that will determine whether an education is good. And given the cultural and social diversity of school children in our countries, education must be tailored in a more individualized manner. Digital media can better link instruction in and outside the classroom. In doing so, it can help compensate for educational disadvantages. It is also clear, however, that teachers have to be appropriately trained in these formats in order to be able to use them efficiently. This is why the German government launched a national program to improve the quality of teacher training. It will invest a total of 500 million euros in the program by 2023. In addition, the German federal and state governments are jointly funding a 5 billion euro digital package to expand necessary modern infrastructure in the schools. I'm eager to hear about your experiences dealing with the developments in the past months and the conclusions you have drawn. I'm certain there's much that we can discuss, and there's much where we can learn from one another. So let me warmly thank the organizers, and let me turn over to Ms. Katrin Reschel, who's the head of the German International School of Silicon Valley, and who knows both systems extremely well and will moderate the discussion. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Haber. I mean, educational systems, Bildungssysteme, have always been in continuous evolution. And we have seen a lot of transformation due to digital changes over the last 10 years. But when COVID-19 hit 7 months ago, as Ambassador Haber just reminded us, the digital transformation was already well on its way. And then in March, it really hit. I took over the head of school position in Silicon Valley on March 1st. Coming from Berlin, I was really literally 9 days on campus before I decided we have to close the school. And it was clear from day one, we cannot close the school, we can just close the building, basically. And school continued, and we had 1 day of teacher training, and the next Monday of my 3rd week here, we started to go online and taught that way. And since March, we have in 7 months probably seen years worth of change. So after we heard from Ambassador Haber, I want to ask Maureen McLaughlin and want to introduce her first. She's a senior advisor to the Secretary of Education and Director of International Affairs at the US Department of Education. In this capacity, she leads and coordinates the department's international activities and engagement, and also spearheaded the development of the US first international strategy in this area. Maureen, with education being delivered at the state and local levels, what is the federal role of your department in the United States? And how has pandemic changed attitudes towards digital education, and what role does a DOED play in these areas of educational technology and distance learning? Please, Maureen.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers and to Ambassador Haber for inviting the Department of Education to join you today. We look forward very much to not only sharing some of our experiences, but really, even more importantly, learning from all of you. So thank you. As you mentioned, education in the United States is a state and local function. Education is delivered at the state and local level. Decisions on curricula, decisions on standards, decisions on all of those kinds of issues are made at the state and local level. So what is the federal role? Federal funding for education is less than $1 out of $10. So what role do we play? And what I thought I might do is just first read the mission statement that is on the walls in our building as you enter, even though most of us haven't entered in a long time. And it is that the mission is to promote student achievement and preparation for global competitiveness by fostering educational excellence and ensuring equal access. So one of the biggest issues that we have, or one of the biggest places that the federal government comes in, is on equity. And it's on helping students who are most at risk, have highest needs, such as students who are in high poverty families, or students with disabilities and others. Another big piece is research and innovation that can be shared across the education system. Collection of data so we can see what is happening both in the United States and comparing ourselves to other countries, and sharing of information. That's our overall goals. And as the pandemic hit, both your experience at your school in your first 2 weeks on the job, and as the ambassador talked about, the pandemic caused lots of changes in education. Schools, school systems all had to pivot pretty quickly to some other way of delivering than they were, be it online, be it digital, be it distance, however it was being done. Some people pivoted more successfully, some schools pivoted more successfully, some places pivoted more successfully, and some it was a bit more of a challenge. And let's be honest, that's still ongoing. Many of our schools are either delivering entirely through distance learning now, or partially, or open. And so it really is a question that balance and et cetera is really ongoing. So we have more distance learning going than before the pandemic hit. We have more blended learning going on, and that we're really learning as this goes ahead. So what's the right balance? And I think that's a big question, and really the right balance of distance, in person, blended learning differs a lot for individual students. And I think the ambassador's comment about personalized learning comes into play right here. We also have a digital divide, and that's not unique to the United States, and it's not caused by the pandemic, but it's highlighted by the pandemic. And that's got questions of access, it's got questions of computer equipment, and it has questions of learning and teaching that is effective through a digital environment. And I think the biggest issue that we're facing here in the U.S. is the significant learning losses that have occurred for many students, especially students who are most at risk, and how is it that those learning losses are both ameliorated, but then that additional learning losses aren't going on over the next few months. And I just want to mention 4 specific areas that the federal government's involved in, and then maybe in terms of technology very quickly. The first is the big federal funding that was provided called the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Stabilization Act. And quite a bit of funding was provided there to help universities and governors and school districts to be able to move to remote learning. Lots of flexibility on how they could spend the money, be it on hardware, software, instructional expertise. But that very much targeted also towards where the needs were greatest. A second piece is that the U.S. Relaxed restrictions on distance learning at the university level. We had restrictions on what portion of a student's degree in college or university could be through distance in order to still be eligible to receive federal student loans and grants and things. So that was quickly relaxed back in March in order to keep students eligible for receiving that aid. It was also relaxed by the Department of Homeland Security for visas for international students, so that international students who were in this country studying, all of a sudden were moving to a full online education, weren't both losing their visa status or anything like that. So that was, I think, important quick changes that were made as a result of the pandemic. And 2 other things. One is that we have a national educational technology plan. We've had this for a while. It was most recently updated in 2017. And it's a document that is really a call for action and a vision for how technology plays out in this country, including real-life examples. That is being updated now, and I think this is actually the sort of perfect time for that to be happening. And we're seeking input from people on that plan. So if anyone here is so inclined to want to be able to comment and get your views into the process that's happening now about updating that plan, please just go Google National Education Technology Plan and give us your comments. We'd love to hear them. We're at the end of that. It will be published in 2021, but our team would love to hear from people both in the United States as well as people in Germany. And then another piece in our information sharing is that we have a new initiative called Ready Now. And this is where 70 developers and researchers came together to produce a new series of guides to education that are providing information on all the kinds of resources that are available in different areas, ready to be used by anybody on any platform. So again, I encourage you to look. This was prepared with our Institute for Education Sciences, but there are Ready Now guides for early learning, for math, for science, for social studies, and for special ed. So those are just a couple of, I think, specific areas of where the federal government is trying to both in this context of the pandemic and the changing conditions, to be able to help states and locals to be able to deliver education and to elevate distance learning and make it as high quality as possible. So thank you, and I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much for this insight. And I would like to ask Professor Meine next, but I need to know if he's here. Professor Meine, can you hear me? That's not. And I wanted to go to Germany next, but maybe we stay a little bit on the West Coast. And I have an echo. If everybody else could unmute themselves again, please. Thank you so much. So I stay at the West Coast and go a little bit up north to Barbara Holzappel. Barbara is originally from Germany, and Barbara's career has spent driving innovation and growth through technology across many different industries. She serves as a VP for Education at Microsoft and is passionate about supporting all students in their learning journey. Barbara, my question for you is, what have been the key lessons learned from the last 7 months of responding to the COVID crisis? And when you addressed the UNESCO's Mobile Learning Week conference a week ago in a very inspiring keynote, you said, I quote, "One of the biggest hurdles for leaders has been balancing short-term decisions with making long-term sustainable investments that will impact how students and teachers learn using technology for years to come." While the pandemic brought a lot of disruption, it also gave us the opportunity to change. So please tell us your thoughts in that direction, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And of course, thank you for the organizers for having me here and for participating. It's a great pleasure. And of course, the topic of German and US exchange is something that is deeply personal and close to my heart, considering my own journey through both education systems. But as you said at the beginning, the last 7 months have brought decades of change within sometimes weeks and days, and certainly a couple of months. And across the world, we've seen, over 1.5 billion students having their formal education disrupted by the pandemic, and millions more, risk of dropping out of their education just due to the economic fallout alone. And so as we sort of look around and helping and supporting different school systems around the world, both in the K-12 segment as well as in higher education, it's all of the challenges that obviously the pandemic brought with it in terms of the disruption. And I think all of the teachers and everybody in the education systems deserve a very particular call out of appreciation in terms of the speed and creativity at which everybody innovated and really took a very student-centered approach with the singular cause and purpose of keeping the students engaged in their learning. But despite all that, it's also given an opportunity to rethink, to think about what should education look like as we move forward? How can we take the learnings of the last couple of months and apply that as we think about what education could and should look like? And of course, applying critical aspects of equity, access, personalization of learning, and making sure that pedagogy and technology are being integrated in a very cohesive fashion, because technology alone is not the solution. Technology is there to support pedagogy, and making sure that these approaches are being put together in a way that really serve the student and the student outcomes is really critical. So what we've seen as we worked with school systems around the world is we sort of saw 3 phases that are being navigated. The first one was obviously just the sheer response to the crisis and the urgency, where school systems had to move really, really quickly, which was basically trying to replicate a regular classroom in an online environment. What we've then seen and that's really where speed was of the essence. And for example, we saw the University of Bologna literally make that transition within 4 days and moving all of their classes to an online environment within 4 days for 90,000 students, which is an immense undertaking. But then what we saw, sort of, especially over the course of the summer, was this sort of transition phase where schools were thinking about how can we reopen? Can we reopen? Do we need a hybrid model? What does that all look like? And looking at how do we keep students really engaged in the learning? And then the third phase, which is where we see a number of school systems at the moment, is to say, how do we really need to reimagine this? And what does that even look like? What are the things that we want to keep out of the digital transformation that has accelerated so quickly over the last couple of months? And what are the changes that and some of the challenges that we see, and what are some of the criteria that we want to apply? So if I want to boil it down to a couple of key elements that we think are going to be critical as we move forward, based on all the learnings that we've had from school systems literally around the globe, is that the notion of personalization is really critical. Personalizing learning for the student based on their needs, making sure the learning is socially embedded, because learning is an inherently social experience of interaction with each other, making sure it's inclusive to provide learners of all abilities access to education and learning possibilities. And again, an area where technology can actually be extremely helpful. If we think about students with dyslexia, there's a lot of tools that can be used there, or learners where English that are learning in a different language, where you have translation support. Education that's also safe and secure, especially in the digital environment, is really critical. And that we pull out the right insights for the learner in terms of where and how they're making progress, for the teacher to see where and how are the students engaging with the learning materials, which is so much harder in a digital environment because you cannot read the body language and all the different levels of interaction that a teacher usually has with the students. And so what's really important here to in that context is to sort of think about how, especially from a technology perspective, that technology can make a lot of these things scalable. Because again, personalized instruction is not new, but it can be more scalable with the use of technology. But again, a key thing that for us to remember in all of this is that the technology serves a purpose, and the purpose is to support the pedagogy. It's not to replace the pedagogy, and making sure that the technology is being used really in the context of what the teachers or the professors want to accomplish with their class, and therefore having the different tools at their disposal and actually being very comfortable in using them is a critical factor in this. Earlier in the conversation, we talked about teacher training, which is an absolutely critical aspect here. So I'll pause here. There's obviously a lot more to cover from kind of what we learned around the world, from how schools and systems responded and are now sort of rethinking their approach to education.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we heard already that we can go on and probably go in many, many different directions with that interesting group of people. And that Barbara now talked first and gives me the chance to join your call out to the teachers. Especially, let me say that to female teachers. You have so many women in that job. And let's face it, they have a special request to deal at home by teaching, having the kids at home, getting the kids on that computer to learn and follow all that. And yeah, fingers crossed that we do not give up what we gained within the last years for employment of women in all countries, and not especially in Germany, but in the US, but in all development countries. So that is another important shout out to all our teachers. Thank you. Professor Meinl is in the call, and now we finally go over to Germany. Professor Meinl joins us from Potsdam, I believe. He has a very impressive biography, as we all read, and starting as a mathematician, he became professor of computer sciences, hold guest professorships all over the world, and joins us today in his capacity as president and CEO of the Hasso-Plattner Institute. Here for me, with my two campuses of the GSSV, one campus is in Mountain View and the other one in San Francisco, so I usually drive by the SAP. And before I drove by the Hasso-Plattner Institute, because I'm from southwestern Berlin, and when I drove to Potsdam, for example, to the wonderful Barberini Museum, I saw your institute grow, and thank you for joining us. Professor Meiner, Christoph, how do you perceive the changes in attitude towards digital education since March? How well prepared was Germany or was the German school system? I heard you say at the Didakta in January, für die Digitalisierung in Deutschland ist die Governance-Struktur denkbar ungünstig. So the governance structure in Germany is very unfortunate. That was even before COVID hit. So please share your perspective with us and how dependent, maybe also how dependent was Germany on international systems when we did the change or not?
Thank you for inviting me. I have three perspectives on the topic, what happens with digital education in the Corona time. The first one is we have for many years an open campus. We use MOOC platform, our MOOC platform openhpi.de for continuing education, for offering teachings for people in IT topics around the world. Second perspective is as a university institute. All the German universities went to the digital-only models. That means in March, when pandemic starts here to become worse, all the universities, all the teaching from the physical world was changed into the digital world. For us as an institute, it was not so difficult because, of course, we are prepared as an institute for digital engineering on such kind of topics. So we have a long tradition in digital teaching. But what I personally experienced is that for the students it was terrible. And I think around the world it's terrible for the students not to be with classmates in the lecture room, to stay at home, to stay in the dormitory or wherever. Many students stay back in the house, in the children's room of the parents' home or house. So, and then all the day only looking to the screen and getting the lot of teaching input. So I think the perspectives of the young generation on that is very good. So the reason is that now we try our semester starts end of October, early November. We start with the hybrid models. We say all the students of the first year, they need to come on the campus. Of course, nobody is forced, but there is the offer that they can come. Of course, we have rules of distance with 1 meter distance for each of the students have to use masks in the lecture. So we need several lecture halls electronically connected to have one big lecture room for all the students which respect the distance rule. And the third perspective is that we got the task 3 years ago when Germany started the Schulpakt. The School Pact is a big financial program to make digital teaching, digital learning possible in German schools. We got the task from the federal government to develop an educational infrastructure integrative for all the systems that are needed and that can be used in the schools, in the classes, but respecting the German, the European data protection. And it is very tricky, though it's not so easy for a German teacher, for example, to use Google Classroom. Reason is such systems need to process the personal data of the pupils to exactly focus the interaction on that knowledge status of this person. And children are young people. They cannot decide for their own. So before a teacher can use such a system, he has to get the permission from all the parents that they allow that he with the class goes to such a system. If you imagine how many different systems are applied and used in school context, in the different classes, for the different ages of the children, for the different topics, then it's practically not manageable. If the teacher has no permission, then he got punished. It's not allowed. He is not following the regulation. So for that reason, we also see the situation in German schools, and when Corona was becoming dangerous and all schools were closed in the lockdown, it was really a nightmare what happened in the schools. There were only very few that simply could switch to the digital mode. Most of them schools are connected to the internet, but the classrooms without Wi-Fi. There was no devices for the children. More difficult. The children they came up with their smartphone, but the teachers were not equipped with the right instrumentarium, and they did not know how to behave in the best way. This is what Barbara already mentioned, the teacher's education. They are not prepared for switching to digital forms of teaching. So these are three very different perspectives, and in each perspective we had a lot. For example, in the first, with our OpenHEI platform, that is used by the World Health Organization, openwho.org. So during the lockdown, 4 million learners enrolled on this platform. Platform runs and is working here in HPI. So we managed, we never break down, but it was really stress, not Corona stress. It was stress to manage systems for so many, such a huge number of learners. Perhaps this is enough for starting our discussion.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. And that is definitely a very interesting perspective and fact that teachers are sometimes behind the students. And that's not only, that's also mental, I can tell you, to be used to, I teach the students, and all of a sudden the kids know probably more or different things about the tool that we are working with. That is quite a challenge in pedagogics and education. And yeah, it is. So thank you. And the fourth panelist is Professor Breitner. He joins us from Northern Germany, from Uni Bremen. And we can probably get a different perspective, or at least add another perspective. He's a specialist in media competency, transforming communication, e-learning, and IT management. And Andreas was recently delegated from the Free Hanseatic city of Bremen to the Television Council of the ZDF, so the area of science and research. And I think that's not just a fun fact, it really adds another perspective. And then Professor Meinl talked about his first-year students. They're at least 18. Our first-year students in the schools are sometimes pre-K, so that is 3-4-year-olds that we are dealing with, and how to have them on the computer and what screen time are we talking about. So therefore, my question to Professor Breitner is, Andreas, in the near future, what is the potential and what are the risks of all these developments we are facing today, taking into account what we heard before from our speakers, policy changes from Maureen and Ambassador Haber, Microsoft and HPI, HPE, what they have in store for us, and maybe all the way to artificial intelligence, and what could that bring for K-12 education? Professor Breiter, yes.
Thanks a lot. Well, for me, it's some sort of a déjà vu because 20 years ago, I did my PhD on the digital transformation, comparing the US school system to the German and the UK school system. And to be very clear about that, it didn't change anything at all since 20 years. So we're talking about that, and Christoph said that already. It's particularly the German education system is completely dysfunctional regarding its governance for ICT development, and that would take a whole speech by itself why it's the case. So I don't want to bore you with this. But the interesting part is that we are we are looking at some sort of which we can use the metaphor of an iceberg. And what we see at the moment on top, with Corona being the focused lens on it, but it happened in Germany and other countries the last decades. On the top of the iceberg, we see a problem of access of infrastructure, and Germany is lagging behind. For all the US attendees, you can't even imagine such a rich country being so much behind in digital infrastructure of schools. We are far beyond countries we don't even know that they exist. So what happened is that we had, and the ambassador explained that 2-3 years ago, the federal government launched a 5 billion program for the next 5 years, and we assume that we need 5 billion every year. So just to have an idea about the dimensions, we're behind, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. And you've already mentioned part curriculum integration, organizational development in schools. So how to embed and integrate IT or digital media as a normal part of teaching and learning. And that again, and that's the bottom of the iceberg, is teacher training, teacher education. If we think about teacher education, if we change it now at our universities, and Christoph is at a university with teacher education, I'm at a university with teacher education, even if we would start now in the first semester, it takes 6 to 8 years until these young guys will be professional teachers if they make it all the way up. So we don't have the time, so we have to invest and put a lot of effort into teacher training, and that's one of the, I think that's one of the main parts we have to think about. And then we are even getting deeper into the iceberg and the question about what is adequate screen time, what is adequate for different age groups, what is adequate time at home, what is adequate time in school, what do we know from research about impact on teaching and learning. And we have to say the results are all across the nations very ambivalent. You find research saying with the specific sort of tools, with specific platforms, students will develop certain skills much better, much easier. But then you have to differentiate between different learner types. You have to differentiate between, of course, socioeconomic background. I mean, we heard about that already. That's not only an issue in the US. It's also an issue in Germany. My state, which is the smallest state of all states, it's the state of Bremen, which is basically 2 cities. We've now invested in tablets from a US company for all students. And we want to start with the students with a very bad socioeconomic background. But what we have in mind is how to support them. One is, again, tip of the iceberg is the infrastructure. I would say that's easy. It's a question of money, and it's a question of a lot of money. But that's just a thing we can start very early. And maybe one last comment on sort of my déjà vu. 20 years ago, we were talking, and I was seeing in my case studies in 4 US states and many, many different schools that there was a very strong movement to data-driven development. So what do we know about teaching and learning? How can we use that for school development, for curriculum development, for teacher training, etc.? And in Germany, and I came back to Germany and said, we need to do that. And they all said, don't you trust your teachers? They know what they're doing. They have an academic education. And maybe in the US, you don't trust your teachers, but in Germany, that's so different. And now we're 20 years later in the US, in US schools, we're using partly artificial intelligence systems to even more support teaching and learning, and we can discuss ethics as well, but just the progress. And in Germany, that's unthinkable. I mean, we're trying it very slowly in universities, and Christoph can I think, add to this as well. But in schools, it's unthinkable. And so we're still sort of, when other countries develop a new progress, we need some time in Germany. But then once we do it well.
Thank you. Let's keep the fingers crossed, I'd say. And it's very interesting that you talk about the déjà vu, and you researched for or compared US and UK, and me coming from the East, I compared Eastern Germany with Russia, of course. So we were looking abroad, certainly with different effects, I'd say. But Maureen, you designed the Department of Education's first international strategy, and that was in 2012. And then you renewed it or made it more fashionable in 2019. That was still before the Corona crisis. And looking back now, where do you see connections where we can use that déjà vu that Andreas just talked about, and that we as Germans probably know that we looked at other countries? What can that maybe transatlantic relationship we have between Germany and the United States, and we heard advantages and disadvantages, can be used to educate education internationally? Maureen.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed the discussions in terms of what's happening in Germany and the observations of once you get going and you pick it up, you'll do it more quickly and do it well, but there's a space before that. I think in terms of our strategy, probably it is time to update it, given coronavirus, but the sort of core of the strategy would stay the same. And the piece of the strategy that's most relevant to the discussion today is one of our three objectives, which is learning from and with other countries in order to strengthen education in the U.S. And the specific things one might want to emphasize for the learning, I suspect would be, and probably could be and should be, somewhat different now than before, with much more of an emphasis on how one reacts to something like a pandemic or, a shock to the system, and how prepared are you for it, and what does it mean, and how do you adjust? And those things are like enormous issues that we hadn't really specifically included or even specifically anticipated. I would say that over the last year, since the pandemic happened, much of the learning that I've been doing, or the places that I've been participating in that, have really been in the multilateral organizations. We heard a little bit before about UNESCO, but the multilateral organizations where we're learning from our bilateral partners, but in that multilateral setting, including with Germany, for instance, in the G20, where they held two education ministerials, one specifically on COVID and on responses, and distance learning, blended learning, how you respond was a key piece of that. Another piece that came up in that particular G20 emphasis that I am very interested in, based on the conversations you just had, is about technology and early learners. The general consensus was that we didn't know much. We didn't know enough about what was the right amount of exposure, or what kind of exposure, et cetera. And OECD is supposed to be undertaking for the G20 under the aegises of Saudi Arabia, a study about young children and learning and technology. So I think that's an enormous area for us to all learn. And then, there's been quite a bit of learning, again, also with OECD, multilateral organizations, to learn whatever we can from other people. Something that I took away from a presentation from Singapore in one of the, maybe more than one of the events that I attended, is a discussion about, let's perhaps think about having deliberately one day a week, once that people are back at school, that is done learning at home. And so that it's blended in as a sort of specific part of a whole education. It's not something you just fall back on, but you build it in. And so if you do have to pivot to something that's more at home, you've already developed the skills, you're ready to do it. That was somewhat, I took away as something to really think seriously about in other countries and in other areas. So I didn't specifically say anything on Germany, in that although Germany has been in many of those conversations with your colleagues. But I'll mention two other places that I feel like we've done a lot of learning with and benefited from our cooperation with Germany. We had a seminar in February, which was supposed to be the first of our new international seminar series, but that kind of didn't quite happen given what happened in March. But the DG from Germany, from the federal government, was our speaker and was talking about the trajectory of reform in Germany and kind of what implications it had to the U.S. And one of the pieces I've always been interested in, and she talked some about, was what has been referred to as the Pisa Shock. So when Germany first participated in the Pisa assessment of 15-year-olds, a sort of a shock of where Germany fell in student learning compared to other countries and the gaps across landers. And that's, I think, something that has a lot of implications also for the U.S. In terms of not only where you are as an average, which average hides a lot, right? But how does it vary by a state, by a district? So that was something that seemed at that time to have caused and pushed for certain kinds of reform to address both the average but also the variance across provinces. I'd be interested, from all of you, any responses on that. And then the other is, the sort of vocational education intersection of work and education, where I think Germany has a lot to offer to the U.S. to really look more carefully at that. And we do have a memorandum of understanding between our Department of Education, Department of Labor, and Department of Commerce with our counterparts in Germany that is designed to say explicitly in that space, what can we all learn from each other? We had planned for a study tour for some Americans to go to Germany this year to kind of to see and look and learn in person, and that obviously didn't happen. So we're adjusting, some of these kinds of learning, but there are I feel personally that every time one has one of these kinds of meetings or exchanges or learning with other countries, that the learning goes in both directions. So even if one country's system is viewed as being advanced in a particular area, you have a discussion about how you do it in your country and how another country does it. You always learn something because then you reflect upon your own basic assumptions, certainly how I feel. It's like, oh, we do it that way. So I have felt that Germany, by being a large decentralized education system, a democracy, and a good partner with the U.S., has been a place where we have learned quite a bit from each other with just those two particular examples that I put out.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. You're frozen on my screen. We heard quite a bit of interesting connections, German-American and towards working international in that field. And Christoph Meine, the GSSV, as most German international schools, will introduce the HPI school cloud sooner or later, be sooner. And we're looking forward to that. But besides that, I understand that the HPI is pretty hooked with MOOCs, that innovative, massive open online courses. And that might be another chance that we combine and we see how international learning can work. You talked about a hybrid solution so far for your university. I know that many schools go into hybrid or go back and forth and will go back and forth maybe in the soon future. So can you tell us a little bit more about that MOOC idea and how that can drive our development in the next couple of years?
This work with the massive open online courses goes back to 2012, when New York Times wrote MOOCs, the year of MOOCs. And we try to think whether it makes sense to provide knowledge individual area on this way to the public. So in my research was interested also in learning, analytics, and other things. And we looked around, there was no platform available to do this, to manage such huge courses with 10,000 of participants. You need, that the MOOCs work well, you need a lot of participants in a course. The idea is the following. Typically with the e-learning, sitting alone in front of the computer, it does not make fun. There are no classmates. Everything, telephone is ringing, girlfriend is coming, whatever. One stops and steps out. So the question was, the social element is missing in this teleteaching. And for most people, social element is so important for learning. Learning in a classroom, learning in a seminar group, learning together, to have classmates you can look around and see, oh, they didn't understand, or he also didn't understand. You can ask questions. You are pushed if you see the other can make it. So you also need to make it. And the question was how to add this social element to the digital education. And the MOOCs is a wonderful idea. I think it came from Stanford, the first famous one. From Canada, there was another group of researchers doing this. So to do not say, here is the learning material. No, to say, next week we start with a course. And you are invited to take part. You are invited to take part. There are no costs, nothing. And then to manage such a platform, learning platform with social media. The more people are taking part in the course, the more active becomes the interaction on the discussion forum. People could exchange ideas, own ideas, can contribute new knowledge, can ask questions. So it proved to be very successful. So the huge number I mentioned is 800,000, which are meanwhile enrolled in any one of the courses. This also teaches us as a university. We learned several things. The first is we need a digital enlightenment. So all people think digital world is fine, so I can use a smartphone, I can work in the internet, but understanding of the digital world needs much more. Needs an understanding what happens with data, how information are transformed, when I are on a platform, what kind of information they know about me. Should I give any kind of information in the social media? This needs to know some background to make an evaluation. Makes it really sense to take this offer, to give my data for something. What is the business model of platforms that are cost-free? Such platforms are immensely expensive to run. If anyone makes you an offer for free, what is the idea behind? So to teach such things, we call it digital enlightenment, and the educational goal is to allow people to move into the digital world self-responsible and in a way that they can make own decisions, not depending from anyone. This was the goal of the Enlightenment 250 years ago, after absolutism time, that the people become citizens, that the people take own responsibility for their life, for their family, for their business. The second is, this one is the goal, the other is university has to be changed. In the moment we are concentrated on young people, 20 to 25, or a little bit older. But by digitalization, the knowledge is increased. So the doubling of knowledge, the doubling time of knowledge becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. The people become older. They have to work longer. So we need more phases of learning in our life than only this university time. And so as a university, we should learn to become lifelong educational advisors for our students. In the beginning, they can come physically to us, to the university. They need this first time outside of their family for learning how to live their own life. But then later on, when they have family, when they have business, we need to provide them, for example, in form of such MOOCs, learning content to stay ahead. In particular, this is true for our branch, for the digital engineers, for the developers, the software architects, because every 10 years, all is changing completely. So this is what we learned with the book.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have more questions from the audience now that go in that direction. We have David Di Gregori, who said, what systems, models, or platforms can schools explore and consider to widen the audience? We heard a little bit from Professor Meiner, and I want to turn it over to Barbara Holzapfel and maybe add the question, if you believe that continued public-private partnerships can bring us towards reaching that goal. Where are we with procedures given by the US Department of Education, by the German government versus the HPI is here, Microsoft is here. Barbara, tell us about it. And
Thank
maybe
you.
also with one more addition. We've heard already about the digital divide that I think we are all sure that we do not widen that, but that could be another aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. And I want to thank Christoph also for his remarks. I was nodding along with many of them, especially the notion of the lifelong learning and how that continuum is evolving over time, and the sort of paradigm shift that underlies that. To your question of public-private partnerships, I think those are a critical element, and to think about how do these things need to work together. To make sure that the educational goals are being achieved. What can be done to limit the digital divide? What models need to be there? What kind of infrastructure needs to be there to make sure that education is accessible? Starting from the device infrastructure all the way to the software that goes on top of it. How can that be made affordable and accessible so that more people can benefit from it? If you also look at how can you make education accessible for individuals who are on migration due to political, economic, and other circumstances? How can you keep students engaged in learning there? How can you make education accessible through smartphones, for example? All of these kinds of questions. There's no silver bullet for any of this. This is a journey, and it all comes back to the local and regional and country context in terms of how is education organized, what kind of systems exist, and how can technology support those advances, and how can all participants in this? One of the areas that we haven't talked about yet is, as part of the pandemic, parents were all of a sudden thrust into a very different position as well, all the way from assistant teacher to technology troubleshooter and anything in between, and balancing their own lives. And how can we bring the different constituents together? Obviously, this is more prevalent in K-12. University students tend to be more self-sufficient. But how can we make sure that as digitization and digital transformation continues, to make sure that all constituents are being brought along in terms of their comfort level in dealing with the technology? And Katrin, you said also earlier, how does the role of the teacher change? When you said, some of the students are more comfortable with the technology, that can be an interesting moment for a teacher to say, wait a second, usually I'm the one with the knowledge. So I think as all of this evolves, there are a lot of different areas to rethink, not just the technology or the pedagogy, how to overcome the digital divide, but also how does the role of the teacher evolve? How does that evolve to more of a question of coach for the students? What are contents that the students can learn on their own through digital media or otherwise, so that classroom time can really be used for that social interaction that Christoph also mentioned earlier, which is such an important part of learning. And so how can digital experiences and in-person experiences be mixed together to move forward, and do that in the context of an approach to digital technology that really supports the pedagogy and brings the constituents together?
Yeah, thank you. And now we have learned about, have heard about lifelong learners, lifelong educators, maybe, and differences in teacher training. Barbara talked about coaches. In Germany, we say Lernbegleiter. So we carry on with the kids. And still, what does it with school organization? And not only in schools, you have Nancy Everhard asking from the panel or from the audience, what do you think? What roles could libraries have, for example, or other things? Like in my school, we have a makerspace now. We have our yearly Shark Tank. We have all that stuff. But at the end of the day, we also have the German Abitur and the SAT tests, and have to prepare our kids for all those. And there is some sort of corset where we need to end at the end, and we should, because we owe that our students as well. But on the other hand, we want to make them to creative thinkers and to all that. And that to keep that balance, I probably want to ask Herr Breitner again. Where do you think there is that balance that should be aware of, or introducing technology in teacher training in schools, but also focus on education? How does education change? How does pedagogic change? What are we concerned to probably lose? What do we gain? So how can we keep that balance? And I still hope that there are things out there that we are not even aware of. And how can we keep that openness also? So, Herr Breitner, where are you?
Very important questions.
Yeah, I was told you but wait a minute. Yeah. I was told you were the wild card at that podium, so please be wild.
I have the wild card.
Tell me all about it.
Brilliant and crazy and wild ideas. That's my profession. No, I think we talk about a lot of this stuff since decades, like individualized learning, personalized learning, lifelong learning. This is not a real new concept. And we also talked for a long time about the potential of digital media. Or the term was computers or ICT, and now we talk about digitalization. So I think there are two speeds, and that's, I think, one of the experience of digital transformation, that you have the speed of technology development on the one hand, and now also, which is sort of increased by Corona, but even before, and then you have changes in teaching and learning and in classroom management and classroom organizations that take much longer. And that's what I always try to symbolize with the metaphor of the iceberg. So the top is easy to see, and we find, sort of easy solutions. I mean, there are technology providers who know how to do that, and we have Christoph and other guys who know how to do it. But going deep down into what is the right balance, particularly now, and I think one of the attendees asked about what can we learn from primary schools or German elementary schools with this sort of approach of hands-on, and it's hands-on and not virtual education. And the same is with school libraries. Just to answer this question, school libraries are dead in Germany. They're deader as it can be. We've lost this tradition, and we now need to reinvent libraries and librarians and information, let's call them information managers, for in the learning process. And I to say what we can, or what will be sort of the next challenge, I think we will find schools that, and that's also two different speeds. We have schools, and within schools, parts which are moving very fast and very innovative and doing, and I guess the international schools are always in a better position. And also, and I think Maureen mentioned that our vocational schools are incredibly innovative. And when we look at the German landscape during Corona, the vocational schools were the ones who could switch very easily because they were far more digitalized, not all of them, but most of them, far more than elementary or secondary schools. And teachers have a different attitude. So we research a lot about teachers' beliefs and attitudes towards technology, and they differ significantly between the US and Germany. And vocational schools could be at least part of this innovative hubs, and we see maker spaces, etc., which are rather there. So we should use also the strength of the German education system, particularly in vocational education, to also support, and that's maybe a question about community learning. The uses vocational schools also to support other schools and the community in digital transformation aspects, open schools, when we can open them again, of course, and just to have some sort of peer learning from each other. That's definitely something we were doing quite well, but we've lost a bit. And so I think the different roles, and this is last remark, again, we're back on teacher education and teacher training. Changing roles of teachers to become moderators or Lernbegleiter, whatever, is again not new, but it takes time and it takes a complete sort of generation. And we have to find a way in between to be innovative at the one hand and sort of to allow us the time in a pretty conservative, and I don't mean that in a political sense, but conservation, a conservative system as the school. I think only the Catholic Church and prisons are similarly traditional and conservative.
I think you are the reinventing organizations. And I'm quite with you here. Thank you. And I mean, that's obviously education. I think you have to look back and think ahead at the same time. And that is a charm, but also the big challenge, I believe. And while we are still dealing with the deadly pandemics, and our governments should certainly be aware of that, let's put that aside for a bit. And as you just said, that international schools, that sometimes they can do more, they are more innovative, they're more free. I think my boss is listening too, but still, I mean, my school here turned 20 just recently. And what would you say, where should we be in 5 or 10 years? And maybe we can take a round through that panel and start. And as I said, we are a German-American school here. We go towards the German Abitur as well as a high school diploma. So our kids get both. We start pre-K, so the 3-year-olds all the way up, and then get them ready, hopefully, for universities all over the place and for innovation all over the place. So what would you say, what really school K-12, pre-K-12 should tackle within the next month? And where should we be in like 5-10 years? Should we start with Andreas and go around again?
I'm sort of less optimistic. I think the schools will return back to normal as soon as they can, and by the way, the universities as well. But there will be parts which will be used and pushed forward. So throughout all my research with school development, I see that as a much longer process. And of course, Corona has sort of speed up the process, hopefully. And so I think one is, what are schools in 5 years? I think German schools in 5 years will have embedded technology in all its sort of areas as a normal feature of teaching and learning, without any sort of not overrated and not underestimated. That's a famous term by Larry Cuban. So in the middle, and that will become normal. And this sounds maybe for a US perspective strange, but for Germany, if we look at the average school, this would be even a revolution, if not a sensation, if we really get to this point where it's used as a normal element of teaching and learning. And this is what I think all, from politics to research to teacher training, we should all work on that. It becomes the new normal.
Okay, thank you. Let's hope for that new normal and that not just goes back. That would be really my biggest fear, to be honest. And we see in the audience a question about the HPE HPI school cloud. So I said it's coming to the US to my school, but there was a question, of course, if it comes in general to US schools. And I want to ask Professor Meinel first, and then Maureen McLavin about this. Professor Meine, what do you say about the HPI School Cloud? Where can we, and in what time frame probably can we count on that?
I also think I can connect this with your question you first asked. The Corona crisis, some people say in Germany they have brought a digitalization push. I do not think so. I think it was a realization push. The people became aware what digital technology could help in this special situation, but also which will change some things in future. So in the moment, the discussion with traveling, with the reduced traveling, but on the other side, to use such video conference systems, we have learned in which cases video conferences can be used, in which situations they will not help. So I am convinced innovation group interaction need personal presence. So it's very difficult to do this via such distance means. Schulcloud, the idea was to provide a platform. You log in, you see the Stundenplan, the plan of lectures a day. There is a pupil's view and the teacher's view on this. And for example, teacher can prepare his class or her class by collecting some materials they want to present, whether this is video or whether this is an interactive software, learning software for learning words, or there are many math programs and other things. So preparing this and being able to invite the pupils to look to this and to do this. So it should be work, something like we work with a smartphone. You have a system where all the functionality is available, everyone is needed, and then there is a part the people can add their own apps simply by bringing them to their smartphone, and then if they want to use the app, they can click and the app works. And cloud technology in the back takes care that such an approach is working. So the teacher should collect the own learning software he needs for his class, but it is simple, and it is so simple like to use and to work with such a device. Because if we think teachers need to be educated to be able to switch on a software, to configure a software and touch it, I think no. It needs this, and Americans are world champions in providing such systems which are so simply to use that everyone can use it. We, I think in Germany also in the governmental system is learning due Corona. Many years in German federal state, the federal level is responsible for giving money and for external affairs and others. The school system is the responsibility for the school system is on the state level, like Poland. And below of the state level, there are the school carrier, Schulträger, which run the schools. And for many years, the states were thinking the schools are responsible for digitalization. The schools, the Schul carriers, the Schul, I think I know the English word, Schulträger are responsible. And of course, they can buy devices, but they are not able to introduce infrastructures and other things. During Corona, the states have learned they are responsible. And so in very short time, they came up with some solutions, which if you have a closer look are not solutions. So this at least has started a discussion. So in general, our federal level, our federal government structure in Germany is very hindering all kinds of digitalization projects. There are so many distributed responsibilities that at the end, we have endless discussion. There are many smart people thinking why something could not work instead of creating things that work. So here I like this American approach. Let's try to do it, and then we learn how we have to do it, and then we can correct. In Germany, we start to discuss what kind of risk could hinder us to do something. And so at the end, we have a lot of theoretical knowledge, but the more of such knowledge we have, the more difficult it is to start to do something. And particularly for this very fast development in digitalization, this is really a problem. But I believe, and I need to be optimistic, that Corona has at least changed that the people understood that digitalization is not an add-on nice to have. So digitalization really can help to solve problems, can help to make education possible in case of illness, in case of closed schools, in case the teacher is not available. And this, I think, will help to bring us to the move which was not done the last 15 years.
Okay, thank you. Optimism and some pessimism about the development in Germany. Let me go over one more time to Maureen McLaughlin to hear from the US perspective what can be globally done from policy making, and then maybe from globally to local, what can schools do in order to, not waste the chance that we have and fulfill all the hopes that we read about. Maureen.
I guess I would say, I think this discussion really highlights the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that what is happening in each of our countries and within our countries is very different depending on what school you're at, what state you're at, what type of school, all kinds of things. And so I think that what will happen will vary quite a bit. I also, when people talk about going back to normal, I don't think we'll go back to normal, or we'll go back to a different normal. And I don't think that we will go back to the quote unquote same thing that we had before. We'll go back to a new normal. And the question is, what is that new normal? And how is it that schools, teachers, classrooms, parents, students take advantage of what has been learned and developed during this time with respect to digital, and where it works and how it works well, combined with what is happening in person, in a classroom, in a school, with your colleagues in person. So I really think I do want to look at this quite optimistically, that people, painful as it may be at times, people are learning and experiencing new things, and that we will be better off at the other end, and that the new normal will be something different, but it will vary dramatically depending on where you are. That's my sort of basic picture.
Yeah, thank you for the basic picture. And if we want to talk about a new normal, we probably need to think about how would you measure, or how would we see that there is a new normal? And Cornelia Grote from the audience even brings it to a more specific question. I'd like to hear your opinion, and what criteria would you say are essential for a school to say it is a digitally advanced school, is her question. And that would be the last time I turn over to Barbara Holzapfel and ask her, what is your criteria when would you say there is a new normal and we are digitally advanced?
Yeah, I don't think there is a back or a new normal. I mean, the way I think about it is that it's education forward. How do we move forward? The pandemic will hopefully subside at some point, but how do we take the lessons learned forward and really lean into what is possible? And as Maureen said, what are how can we bring the good pieces together from an in-classroom instruction and the support and the scalability that technology can bring? One of the things that we haven't touched on so far, we've talked about technology as more at the infrastructure level, or as a learning management system in terms of how you can organize your your classroom, your schedules, your curriculum, the assignments, and all of these kinds of things. I think another critical element in this is also how are we teaching the use of technology in the classroom? How are we teaching coding, for example, or computer science? How is that being taken into consideration as we think about technology in the broader sense of education, so that it's not just a question of the infrastructure for running the school, organizing the school, how the classrooms get delivered, but also how are we bringing technology skills into the classroom. So that's one other thing I wanted to probably beyond our time today, but obviously also a question of how do you computer science is typically more taught either in the university level or then sort of at the high school level. But how can we bring the students closer to the use of technology earlier in the curriculum, and what does that mean? So the other piece, in terms of digitally advanced, it's a really great question. I'm not sure if this is the key label that is needed, because digitally advanced in and of itself, I'm not sure if that's the key criteria. The question is, at least in my mind, as we think forward, I go back to some of the criteria I mentioned at the beginning of the session in terms of, can we take the lessons learned from the last 7 months to think about how can technology help personalize learning? How can, what are some of the technologies that can help bring students together, that are more in the collaboration space, to enable the interaction, other, video-supported tools that give students a way to capture their learning and their voice, and how can that be embedded? The inclusiveness, I come back to that as well. So that's another key aspect in this. So I think for me, the label of digitally advanced, I think needs a double click to say, is this an education experience that's personalized, that offers a social interaction, that is inclusive of all learning abilities, and that provides a safe and secure environment. Those are 4 criteria that I would put out there to say, to keep in mind as we reimagine and rethink education, those criteria being incorporated, and therefore, depending on which local region or country circumstances exist, what is the best path forward? I mean, we've seen just within the U.S., and Maureen is a lot closer to this than I am, but just between California, working with school districts in California, all the way to Florida, Georgia, Texas, all across the country, we've seen many different approaches in terms of how schools responded. We've worked with school systems in Africa, with school systems in Argentina. And while they might all end up using the same technology, where the starting point and how they think about their education and the community that it's embedded in are very different. And from there, looking at the different tools and how do you bring them together is really critical. So I like the simplicity of a digitally advanced label, but I think it really needs that double click and look at some of those criteria in terms of how we move education forward.
Thank you so much. And I think reimagining and rethinking education is a key here. And I mean, we have such a wonderful group here together, and I think we could go on and dive into different directions with our conversation. We come to an end by time. Even if Corona would be over, I think we are not at a happy end with digitalization of schools yet. It's basically a start, and I want to thank you, Professor Meine, thank you, Barbara Holzapfel, thank you, Maureen McLaughlin, thank you, Breitner, thank you to the Embassy in DC and to the Consulate in San Francisco. And while I say thank you and farewell, I would love to see it as a start of a discussion, and it should be continued, and there are so many things and to tackle it from those different angles: technology, policymakers, education, teacher training, students, is necessary in the future. I do not like Corona. I do not want to say that, but I really like the position that we're in now, that we have to discuss, that we should use that chance and challenge our schools and change our school systems all the way to the universities. Thank you so much, and I hope we stay lifelong learners and educators. Thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Catherine, for a wonderful moderation. Really appreciate it. Thank you, and good luck in your school as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you all. I could keep nodding along here. All right. Bye-bye. Have a good day.